Applause. We're going to start the next session now, a fascinating session which combines a museum and art and an artist, where there is an overlap in vision and thought. I invite Tasneem Zakaria Mehta on stage. Her vision has transformed what was once a ramshackle building into an amazing museum which lives, breathes, and speaks. And Janeita Singh, will you please also come on stage? And talking to them is Veerangana Solanki. And we're going to have this wonderful session where art, craft, and history meet in the course of a single hour. Enjoy it.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you to the festival for inviting me to moderate this. When Niloofar wrote to me asking me to moderate the panel between Mrs. Mehta and Janeita's book, my first response was to think about how a museum and an artist would intersect on a panel. I'll begin by introducing Mrs. Singh Ms. Mehta first. An art historian, curator, designer, conversationalist, and cultural activist. Ms. Tasneem Mehta is the managing trustee and director of the Dr. Bhaudaji Lad Museum in Mumbai, the wonderful book which we'll be talking about today of the 101 objects from the museum. Janeita Singh is an author and an art critic. Her recent monograph on F.N. Souza, the archetypal artist, concludes a 12-year research project, which we'll also be discussing in connection with her research in a psychoanalytic way with Jung. So as I mentioned, that the first two things that I started thinking about when I went through the books was how to connect a museum with an artist. And the tangents that came about was to think of the museum, the Bhaudaji Lad Museum, the Bhaudaji Lad Museum and Souza as... am I not audible?
Just tell them to increase the volume.
But they can, yeah.
The people at the back are saying they can't hear.
Okay. Okay. So to think of Bombay and Souza as the protagonists of the two books. My first question, Ms. Mehta, is for you. From Bombay to Mumbai, the way the city has transformed, it is a city that so many locals celebrate as a person in some ways, how you look at the city. But the museum that you have restored and held for over a decade now, the Bhaudaji Lad Museum, it carries a country's history with it. And it also, in so many ways, carries trails from what it's meant for a city to be built with its infrastructure, with its port, with its architecture, but also carries things such as carpets from the Yaroda jail, the Bombay coins, and most recently, so many contemporary artists with your intervention. So what could you maybe touch upon, say, 2 or 3 narratives which for you have been key to create this book, and also benchmarks for you to take on the project of restoring the museum itself?
So I want to start with thanking Rahul and Niloofar for inviting me here to share this story, and to just say that you know, following from Prahlad is a tough act. And even before that, we've had such an incredible day with William and Mr. Subramaniam and the gentlemen who were talking about their whole experience with the army, that I almost feel this is far too serious for an afternoon session, you know. So I'm going to just tell you a little bit about what my wars were and what my challenges were, in a sense, you know, personalizing it a little bit, and to take on a project like the museum, which belonged to the Mumbai Municipal Corporation. And if you've had any dealings at any time with a municipal corporation, you know just how challenging that is. And to do that, it was just, you know, a certain idealism, like what Prahlad was talking about. It was just the sense that I'd come back from studying in America. I was at Columbia University, and I was a docent at the Met. And this incredible institution that is probably the leading museum in the world. And I was so deeply involved with Indian art and culture. I had gone, before I went to America, I was at the J.J. School of Art. And so it was really that sense of, why can't we be as good as them? Why can't we tell the stories or present our objects? We have such incredible, amazing culture. What is it that is preventing us? So there was a certain idealism, a certain sense of, oh, I can do this, just like Prahlad was talking about, you know, so what? It's not a big deal, just get on with it. But actually, it is, now when I look back, I think, yeah, not many people would have taken it on. And probably the municipal commissioner and the people there who saw this young woman 20, 30 years ago when I started. I was working with INTAC also in Bombay. I'd come back, and I was working with INTAC as the convener. Mrs. Pupul Jayakar was there. And so because of that, she was a little bit of a sort of a good fairy figure in the background. But people looked at me when I made these proposals saying that we would restore this amazing museum, that we would turn it around. And they sort of looked at me and thought, well, you know, maybe she can do it. And because of Mrs. Jayakar, really, we were able to move forward. I'd also been involved through INTAC with the Elephanta Caves, with restoring that, and that was a huge success. And with other projects, the Municipal Corporation Hall had burnt down, so I had done that. So slowly, incrementally sort of built up a kind of credibility. But even then, it involved the corporation. When I went to see the commissioner, said to me, don't expect me to give you any money, okay? You have to go out and raise the money. You want to restore the building, fine. So I said, well, sir, can you give us a small room for a conservation lab? Because can you imagine in all of Western India, this is about 20, 25 years ago, about 30 years ago, there isn't a single conservation lab to deal with the deterioration of our objects. So how do museums deal with the fact that deterioration happens because of many, many reasons, climatic conditions, etc. So I said, we'll set up a conservation lab. And it's a lab that will also service not only this museum, but it will also service the other museums in Maharashtra. He thought about it and he said, okay, that sounds like a good idea. And so they said, you go and find the funds. Then I had to go approach corporates. Again, a lot of the corporates were very skeptical. You want to take up a museum that belongs to the municipal corporation? Do you know what you're getting into? So of course I didn't. And I sort of persisted and persisted. And then we did, because Elephanta and the restoration of the fire damaged Municipal Corporation Hall was so successful, the Bajaj Group actually said to me, okay, give us a proposal. And I was so anxious about it. And if I tell you the amount of money, you won't believe it. We went with a proposal to restore the museum. It wasn't even 1 crore. I think it was 75 lakhs 20 years ago. And 10 years later, when we were working together, the commissioner told me, he said, you did this in such little money, you have actually created a problem for me, because now you've become the benchmark and people will ask me, why are your projects costing so much? Anyway, so I'm telling you more of a kind of a personal narrative of how it happened. And I managed to raise the funds, which was the seed funds for the project. And then we won UNESCO's highest award, the Award of Excellence, which was the first time India won the Award of Excellence. And we, and then from there, just went on kept changing the goalposts. We started with the building, we started small. Then we said, we should do the collection. You can't have a beautiful building and not have, have a shabby looking collection. So then we put in a proposal for the collection. Then the municipal corporation said, now the Bajaj are giving the money and they are going to get all the credit for it. So we should also now give money. So then they gave 50% to restore the objects. And we did about 5,000 objects. And the project took about 5 years. And then, it had many, many challenges, because at that time I was working with the Shiv Sena was running the corporation. And then now, of course, we're very good friends, but at that time, the Shiv Sena didn't like the Congress. So we had invited the Prime Minister to come for the opening. And the Shiv Sena decided, no, they didn't want the Congress to come and open the building. So they, Uddhav Thackeray, who was supposed to be there, I don't know how much press is there, but this is the truth. He was supposed to be there, they managed to find a way of sort of literally, he said something about the Congress, which would hit the front pages of the newspaper. And we had actually had all the security checks done. The dogs had gone through the museum. We had sealed every part of the museum. And the next day in the morning, front pages of the paper, Mr. Thackeray said something about the Prime Minister. And the Congress cancelled the opening that was supposed to happen the next day. So then it went into a kind of cold storage. We waited. And finally, Rahul Bajaj, who was very much involved with and who had been our donor and who supported, we decided that, okay, there's a Maharashtrian president. We should go to, maybe that will be acceptable to Mr. Thackeray. So we asked him. He said yes. And Rahul Bhai and I went to meet the president. We invited her to come and open the museum. And she was delighted to come. And 2 weeks before she was supposed to come, Uddhav Thackeray decided he had to go to see his Kul Devta, the god. She's a goddess in the southern part of Maharashtra, I think. And he was going to be away for 2 weeks on this thing. And so he would not be available for the opening. So we had to cancel. And you don't cancel an engagement with the president. The president cancels an engagement. We had those kind of extraordinary challenges throughout, and many, many others. What I'm telling you is, of course, the most public and the most known and the most probably interesting. But there were many, many other challenges along the way. Yeah, so that's how we established this museum.
That's really incredible, but although you're laughing about it now, I can just imagine what it must have been to go through that. But it still holds so much of a history which is rooted to one point. And Janeita, coming to you as an through your book, you've opened up an artist through a world of art history with references to many Western artists as well, but also the intersection of Indian art and architecture historically, with 12 years of research and 5 extremely resilient sections of the book, which start with Sousa as a feminist, his nude paintings, his rebellious childhood, the grotesque and the carnivalesque, which feed into Jung's lens of the East-West philosophy, which you cover. My question is perhaps 2 points, which might seem conflicting, but coming to first the psychoanalytic way of referring to Sousa as a feminist artist, how did you determine this with a worldwide view of history that has helped to create almost a new persona for an artist who's been written about very differently so far?
So, this is my book, F.N. Sousa, the archetypal artist. And taking from what Tasneem was talking about, I'm going to read a quote from my book, which reads, "This is a fundamental view of the world." It says that when you build a thing, you cannot merely build that thing in isolation, but must repair the world around it and within it, so that the larger world at that one place becomes more coherent and more whole, and the thing which you make takes its place in the web of nature as you make it. So, going with the question, why do we call Sousa a feminist artist? Why do I? Like, my first 2 sections are completely dedicated to Sousa as a feminist artist. So I like to begin with the quote at the beginning of the session, of this section, which reads, "My own definition of a feminist is a man or a woman who says, yes, there's a problem with gender as it is today, and we must fix it. We must do better. All of us, men and women, must do better. The best feminist I know is my brother, Kene, good-looking and a very masculine young man." So this quote is by Chimananda Ngozi, and that's how I begin my feminist reading of Sousa's art. And now I will just read a few more lines about my first interlude with the female nude in Sousa's art. "I walked in one day and saw the golden nude through the window glass of the exhibition gallery. It was weird, I thought, seeing myself as the woman striking a nonchalant pose on the canvas. One might have otherwise expected the guilt-ridden, bashful Venus Pudica types with a perpetual blush marking her countenance, or a more prevalent supine, spread-eagled, spineless she form. But this golden nude was different. They told me the famous, and in other ways, the infamous artist F.N. Sousa was dead. So then I stepped inside the gallery, and there were these, portrayals of his nudes all along. It was semicircular in shape, and they were all framed images. And I looked at them. Some of them had an empty, beatific intelligence on their faces, while others stood gazing in a matter-of-fact way or caught in an agonizing moment. A few more stood laughing. Was it maddening laughter or a triumphant whoop? But, surprisingly, not one seemed shy, skinny, shamefaced, self-conscious, self-effacing, shrinking, or sheepish. An air of confidence marked the body language of the nudes. They weren't titillating, sexually inviting or erotic in the cliched sense, but rather grotesque and ugly. They seem to portray women more naturally than any other female portraits I had seen through art history. They were definitely more inclined to Indian temple art, but with a distinctive modernist twist. So that was my first interlude, which drew me in. And I was also going through a personal crisis that time and trying to find balance. And so I began my research, and the essays began coming. I would write about, two to three essays in a year. The rest of the time, I was traveling, reading, researching. Watching those nudes, I felt as if the whole place had been illuminated. And here was an artist who really wanted to mingle and have a real conversation. Here was someone who'd been privy to those hush-hush feminine affairs where society had never wanted to go and see. So beyond scopophilia, I became a woman looking at Sousa, look at women. And Sousa's women, the female nudes, startled critics and viewers alike, because such brazen women had never been seen. Because the everyday women in life that we see look demure and downcast, brought up on paternal values. And then I went on to that Sousa's conceptualization of human beings and intercourse between them can be interpreted as postmodernist and post-anarchist. Now, the feminist movement came in this world in the 1970s, where women artists began performing using their own bodies and making those vulgar, titillating, erotic, awe-inspiring, secretive female concepts normal and mainstream. But Sousa began this 40 years before the feminist movement took New York by a storm in the 1970s. So that's how I've kind of argued in my essays. And also, I would say it's not just about women as we are. It's about the feminine energy, which has been denied for centuries. And the world is the way it is, because that feminine energy is not in balance with the masculine energy which plays out into the world. So if the world is torn by conflict and war and terrorism, it's because of that lack of balance. And Sousa was a visionary artist who, through his brilliance and genius, he tried to bring about that balance. And what he was doing is not so much to do with what no one had seen, but rather to think what no one had thought about that which everyone sees. So he was bringing a totally new perspective. He crafted an emancipated language of equality and freedom through his female nude. And at par runs parallel his Head series, where it is a reach for the numinous. So in a way, he was dissolving the duality between the body and the mind. So his Head series is as prolific as his female nude series. And these are themes that he kind of, adhered to throughout his life. He did not change his themes. And he began when he was a 16-year-old artist. So that means the churning in his psyche began when he was 12, 13 years old. So that when he's 16 years, he comes out with such emancipated figures and heads on his canvas. Did you ask the second part also?
It was a connection to
The
his
feminist.
expansion, yes, the feminist, but a connection to the art history. Perhaps I can club that with my second question, which
Okay.
is also related to the progressive artist group, which, Ms. Mehta, you mentioned in your book that at the museum, one of the gaps that you saw was there not being any artists from the progressive artist group, which is a significant part of the modern art history within India. But there is a mention of Pradumna Singh, who, Pradumna Tanna, who you mentioned references to the Rajput miniature paintings who influenced the progressive artist group. But yet, through your interventions with contemporary art, you have brought the artist back to the center of the museum and, in a way, recreated the narrative of what the artist has meant for the artifacts, for the museum collection itself. And how do you see that as maybe filling up a gap or a conversation to this period in modern art in India?
So, you know, we don't understand how insidious the British educational system was in trying to really capture our minds and make us, as Macaulay said, make us into little Englishmen. And one of the instruments that they used, obviously, museums are really adjunct educational institutions, but one of the institutions they used to do this were museums. So the displays and the way objects were interpreted. What are objects? Objects are a window into another world. But the way the objects were interpreted, the way they were codified, the taxonomies used, were all very much within a certain language, a certain Enlightenment way of thinking that privileged, obviously, the Europeans and the British as the most emancipated, and the Indians were considered to be very good craftspeople. So the museum has mostly, and if you look at most museums in India, they have decorative objects. They have objects made by craftspeople. A lot of these objects were modified for trade with Europe, with Britain, because the British were only interested in making money. They were not interested in spending any money on Indians. Every time they had a project, like even the museum project, when it was being built, it was the first museum to be built in Mumbai. Sorry, I'm digressing and going back a little. But it was the first museum to be built, probably in India. It was founded later than the Kolkata Museum, but it was the first purpose-built museum building to honor the Queen when the Crown took over from the East India Company, and they were struggling with funds. Most of the merchant princes of Mumbai contributed to this, but they were struggling with funds, and the building was languishing, and they went to the Governor General. He was very reluctant. He had to go to the governors in London, and they said no. And then he had to go back again and try and convince them that this was a project to honor the Queen, and then very reluctantly they gave. So we don't understand, they didn't want to spend any money. They wanted to take all the money and they wanted to control our minds. And so museums were part of this project. And one of the things was that they didn't think Indians were capable of fine art. Now, fine art, if you went abroad, from the Renaissance, the Raphaels, the Leonardos, etc., that was the acme of achievement as an artist. If you were a fine artist, if you could do particularly paintings that depicted important historic scenes, wars, etc. So Indians were considered incapable of doing that because Indians didn't have the intellectual refinement to do that. So that, and so most of the objects in the museum are very beautiful objects made by Indian craftspeople, all sort of the best that were there at the time in the 19th century, but there was no painting. no painting, because painting was considered, or sculpture. One, because the British reviled Indian sculpture. They thought Indian sculpture was horrendous. And they didn't think Indian painting was worth anything. They thought it was juvenile. They looked at miniature paintings and thought that it was juvenile because it was done in a simplistic way. They didn't understand the ideological basis for the paintings. So when I took on the museum, I was determined to sort of also do a political riposte in a kind of way, to unravel, unpack this very colonial thinking, which I have to say, not a single other museum in the country has done. They have just accepted verbatim what the British have said about the objects, and that's what is presented. That is the literature that you will see in museums. That is the literature that you will see in publications as well. That's why the book, because the book is also an effort at decolonizing and showcasing not only the stories of the objects, but also decolonizing the institution. So it was really a way of challenging the kind of thinking and the kind of interpretations that were brought to an understanding of Indian art, but also to foreground Indian artists, because our museums are languishing, as you know, and there is so much incredible talent in our country in terms of art, and where are the platforms? Where are the platforms to showcase this? We need institutional platforms, not just galleries. Galleries don't have the kind of mass visitation, nor do they have the reach, nor do they have the stature of a museum. So my intention was very much to foreground Indian art practice, to showcase it, to present it, and make a statement really to the world in a sense that, so being a good museum was the starting point. If you want to be taken seriously by your cohorts across the world, you have to be good at what you do. And I worked very hard at making us probably what is considered one of the best museums today in India. And then foregrounding Indian art, both as a political riposte, as a way of decolonizing, but also as a way of inviting artists to look at that history. It's a very troubled history, and to unpack it not in a didactic way, not in a way that becomes like, this is the way you need to think about things. You don't want to repeat the whole colonial way of teaching. So, but to make it an engagement, to make it interesting, challenging, like a quiz, you sort of unpack and tease the understanding of what these objects are, why they are, what the artworks are. And so that has really been the underpinning. And it's very much like what Sousa said. Sousa was very critical also of the whole colonial way of teaching and controlling. And I think one of the ways of my sort of working with contemporary artists and modern artists in the museum was to really to make it a much more informal engagement. Yeah.
Taking that reference that you said about art history, right? So I would add to that, to my reading, is that through art history, the woman right from Praxiteles, who was a sculptor in the Greek classical period, like there's a quote by Sousa, like if you want to understand modern art, you have to know the art forms from Praxiteles to Picasso, from Han to Manchu dynasty, and from Mohenjo-daro to Francis Newton Sousa. So when you trace that lineage of the female portrait in art history, is that a woman was embellished with modesty, with shame, with eroticism and fantasy. But Sousa turned the tables, like he kind of, nailed it and hammered it in when he crafted his figures on his canvas, beginning from 16, 17, 18. And he had the chutzpah to go out and exhibit his work at that age. When artists are so divided conflicted by their own sexuality, with the undergirding of didactic parental scripts, the brutal state and religious machinery, mangled human instincts, the socio-cultural mapping. So with this whole context, Sousa goes out and does what he has to do. And he embellished the woman with strength, autonomy, and agency. So that was like a great radical thing to do. And he's 18 years and he's called a rebel artist. Because when people looked at his canvas, they were shocked and they were bewildered that what is he doing? But he was bringing in this totally radical, new, original, distinctive figure on his canvas.
And to connect that, Sousa was also one of the founders of the Progressive Artist Group, where this group of artists was rejecting what was happening in the Bengal school at the time of India's independence, and also, in a way, looking to the West. Now, coming back to how you do have Western art historical references, and these are things which, as you mentioned earlier, were not necessarily what Sousa documented, but what you have observed. You also move the narrative into leaning towards Indian art history, the Khajuraho temples, and bringing him back to India in some way, which is also a question of whether you consider this parallelly with the other progressive artist groups as well, because I think Sousa was one of the earliest to also travel out but come back to India, and how he influenced so many artists who return at different points. Some even had studios outside.
All right, so there's this critic from London, like Sousa had his peak period in London for 10 years, where he reigned supreme, and by the end of it, he was counted as a British artist, and he represented Britain in the Guggenheim, and then won an award also. So John Berger said, Sousa straddles many traditions, but serves none. So Sousa, I think, took the best of Indian classical art, primitive art, the European masters, also art from Polynesia, from Japan. I've done a comparative study of his art with ukiyo-e from Japan, as well miniature paintings that there's this famous painting, Birth, where I have contrasted and compared with a Jain miniature painting. So Sousa oscillated between these various schools of thought, but what he put on his canvas was an original signature. So even if he is like tapping into Indian classical art, the South Indian bronzes, or he spoke about the Gupta period, of how that influenced him so much. You know, they had the goddesses at the back of the coins. So in my book, I have these images of the Gupta coins, and then I have enumerated paintings, and I've suggested the resonance between those figures, right? So even when he was tapping into Indian classical art, it was that, I think I need to give an example here. So he said that a color does not have any value. A color comes alive in a mosaic. So I have learned from the miniature painters, who are the best colorists. So he takes this technique of, in fact, my cover page, the image it comes from a series of Sousa paintings, which is called the Sousa Kalam. And this he did in collaboration with miniature painters. So there's this very famous painting by Sousa, which is titled as Golgotha in Goa. As we all know, he was born in Goa and brought up in Goa, Bombay. So Golgotha in Goa is like, he's taken that technique of miniature painter. So it's a mosaic of color. You know, there's multiple colors, right? And he juxtaposes the cruelty and pathos of Golgotha with the Gothic churches in Goa. He brings them together. So the Gothic church in Goa with the splendor and festivity, and there's this very poignant scene in front of that of Golgotha. So in a way, it's a powerful satire where he is, pointing to the gluttonous celebration of wealth around the tableau of Jesus carrying the cross and walking. So that's what he would do, take a technique, take a style from a certain school, but then give it his own expression, his own symbolism, his own message. And Sousa is a cerebral artist. It's the concept and the idea on the page that he gives shape and form with elements of art. But it's the concept which is important. There's nothing, it's just a figure standing there, or two people, or the group of people. But you've got to read into the whole psychological implication and context, the socio-cultural context, and which he is challenging, resisting, and giving it a new narrative. So similarly, there's this painting, Bathers, by Sousa, and he's pulling from different strands. We are all very familiar with Krishna Leela and the Vastraharan scene. Now, there was this proliferation of images at the turn of the 20th century when the printing press had been invented and lithography and so on. So these images appeared on labels, on matchboxes, and calendar art. And Krishna Leela is a part and parcel of our household. It's like what we grow up with. So in Bathers, he takes influences from there, and he takes influences from César's painting, which is large bathers, and Matisse' painting, Joy of Life. And he puts them all together, and he comes up with his painting, Bathers. You must see it in the book, and how this comparative study, right? So he's taken elements from Western art and from Indian art, and he came out with his own. And what is so radical, the radical facet about Bathers is the natural ease of the woman standing with the landscape behind them and their children. So they're just merging with the landscape. They're not conscious, they're just themselves, they're grooming themselves besides a riverbank.
Thank
So
you.
it's not like, it doesn't really parlay into voyeurism or vulgarity, but rather it's kind of emancipation, agency, and presence.
Thank you ever so much. Thank you. I can see how passionate both of you are about what you do. Thank you for that session. We are running a bit late behind time, so we're going to break for tea. And if you could bring your cups and come back in 15 minutes, we can try and catch up on 15 minutes at least. Thank you.